right, good evening, everyone. A little bit too much excitement this morning with all the, interesting guests that we got visits from. But, this event is traditionally the most favorite event run by Tanenbaum Center for Jewish Studies, because this is when we get to see the fruits of our labor, your hard work, and we take all the credit ourselves, so I am very excited to be part of it, to be sitting here learning from you, listening your papers on your research. And it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce a wonderful keynote presenter for today for Schwartz-Reisman Graduate Conference in Jewish Studies, Professor Shirli Gilbert, who crossed Atlantic to speak to you. And thank you, Professor Gilbert, for staying all day, for your questions, for your insights to our student. It means a lot. Professor Gilbert is a specialist in modern Jewish history. Her interests range from history of the Holocaust, modern Jewish identity, Jews in South Africa, and most recently, I understand the relationship between Jews and race. And she's going to talk about that later tonight. So right now, she holds the position of, Carton Professor in Modern History, right? No.
Jewish history of UCL.
Okay.
That was the only.
That's the only. Before that, she was a Carton Professor in Modern History and Director of Parkinson's Institute for Jewish, Non-Jewish Relationship at the University of Southampton. Right now, she's at University College London. And before that was a member of the postdoctoral fellows of the Society of Fellows at University of Michigan. Her D field comes from Oxford University. And her scholarship is wide-ranging and equally exciting. I got to know Professor Gilbert's work through her first book called Music in the Holocaust, which came out from Oxford University Press in 2005. It's the first in-depth study of Jewish music created in ghettos and camps from the position of people actually creating and performing that music. One of the biggest sensations once the book came out was that Dr. Gilbert argued for the first time that music produced in those ghettos should not be seen as an example, as a sole example of resistance. In other words, thinking of this music as something that gave people comfort, something that they produced, as opposed to thinking of it as an expression of resistance. It created a lot of discussion until today. I've been to conference where people were analyzing that insight, and I think it really transformed the field of modern Jewish history, and especially history of the Holocaust. So that book was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. It was also basis of a large educational website called Music and the Holocaust, and a documentary feature on BBC Radio 3, as well as a number of concerts. Now, her second book, called From Things Lost, Forgotten Letters and the Legacy of the Holocaust, which came out from Wayne State University Press in 2017, addresses the studies of German Jewish refugees. It's based on 2,000 letters belonging to a German Jewish refugee who came to South Africa. His name was Rudolf Schwab, and he corresponded with family and friends across the world, including a close friend who became a Nazi. Now, this book also got tons of recognition. She was awarded British Association for Jewish Studies Book Prize Special Mention. There was also an exhibit based on that book and a number of other public facing events. And one of the features of Professor Gilbert's scholarship is in-depth academic research, but also really bringing public-facing scholarship into conducting her academic work. Now, her most recent research focuses on changing landscape of South African Jewish identity from the 1940s and present. She's published widely on the ways in which Holocaust shaped the understanding of arts and responses to apartheid in 1948 to 1994, and has done a number of other projects. Okay, I'm not going to read her full bio because otherwise you'll just listen to me and not her. But without any more praise, I hope you're sufficiently excited. I welcome Professor Gilbert to deliver her keynote presentation.
Thank you so much, Anna, for that very extensive, somewhat embarrassingly extensive and very generous introduction. Thank you. Thank you also, Miriam and Julie, for organizing such a fantastic graduate conference, and to all of the speakers and all of you here today. It's wonderful to observe your intellectual community and be part of it for a day. And also to all the staff, to Constance and all the staff at the Center for Jewish Studies, who've been remarkably efficient and have extended amazing hospitality. So it's really lovely to be here. So in my talk today, I'm going to be focusing on the roughly 6,000 Jews who fled Nazi Germany in the mid-1930s, or primarily between 1933 and 1936, and ended up in South Africa. Most of them came to South Africa as a last resort when all the other options that they had tried had failed. But South Africa is a very interesting destination of settlement to study, because although it didn't receive numbers as large as, for example, the United States and Argentina did, it did end up hosting the largest group of Jewish refugees on the African continent, and considerably more refugees than many other places in the global south. And over the last few years, we've begun to learn more about those unlikely destinations of refuge, places like Iran and India and Mexico and so on. Moreover, unlike many of those places of refuge, South Africa became a place of settlement rather than of transit. There were a handful of refugees who left in the 1940s and 50s, but the vast majority of those who arrived in the 1930s chose to stay. So in my talk today, I'm going to be addressing one significant aspect of the refugees' history, and that is their engagement with local racism before and during the early years of apartheid, so in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. Why this topic? Because the society into which they arrived in the 1930s was already one that was firmly predicated on white dominance, with a highly stratified racial hierarchy in which their own position as Jews was somewhat unclear, and I'll have a little bit more to say on that. Afrikaner nationalism was gaining ground at that time, and ultimately in 1948, the National Party came to political power with its policy of apartheid, which was an institutionalized system of racial segregation and subjugation. So formally, apartheid began in 1948 and formally ended in 1994. So members of the National Party were nicknamed by their opponents the Mala Nazis. This was a play on the name of the party's leader, and also a clear sign of the party's ideological inclinations. So some research has been done on the experiences of German Jewish refugees. Most of it has focused on their arrival and their contributions to South African life. And the strain of Jewish contributionism is something that those of you familiar with the writing of Jewish history will probably be familiar with. It's not an unfamiliar trend, but certainly the literature on those German Jewish refugees has very much been in that vein. We still know very little about their journeys to South Africa, their encounters with local populations, and how they adapted to South African society, South African politics, South African life over time. The research on South African Jews' responses to apartheid specifically, by contrast, is really quite substantial. It's probably the most substantial area of South African Jewish history, and it focuses on two distinct areas. On the one hand, a lot of attention has been given, and this is not just in scholarship, by the way, this is also in popular memory. I find that people who have heard about Jews in South Africa have probably, if they've heard anything, it will have been this. And that is the extensive involvement of Jewish individuals, disproportionate to their percentage in the population, in radical opposition to the apartheid regime. And I'm defining radical here as high risk and sometimes violent activities aimed at sabotaging the political regime. So on the one hand, you have these Jewish individuals who are radically opposed to the regime. They're a fairly small number. On the other hand, there has been more torturous discussion about the responses of the Jewish mainstream leadership, which did not speak out against apartheid until the mid-1980s. In other words, when it was already becoming clear that some kind of political transition of some kind was on the horizon. So while both of those subjects have received a lot of scholarly as well as public attention, it's perhaps surprising that almost no consideration has been given to how this distinctive group of Jews, refugees from Nazism, perceived the racist attitudes and practices that they encountered in their new homeland. So I mentioned that there were about 6,000 refugees. The responses of such a large group cannot be easily generalized, as what one might expect with a group of this size, but they do reveal some distinctive patterns, and I'm going to gesture towards some of those patterns in my talk. To foreshadow briefly what those patterns are, for the majority of refugees, the job of building a new life was the unquestionable priority. If they saw parallels between Nazi Germany and South Africa, most of them chose not to pay close attention. But of the minority of refugees who were concerned about South African racism, what's interesting is that very few of them chose the route of radical activism, as did those small numbers of Jews who sought to challenge the regime. Instead, if German Jews sought to challenge the racist underpinnings of the state, they were more likely to do so in the social and cultural spheres, as journalists, as educators, social workers, and intellectuals, or via legal political routes, in liberal politics and in parliamentary opposition. So there are multiple potential factors that shaped these responses, and I'm going to say a little bit more about what I think those factors might be towards the end of my talk. In researching this history, I've relied mainly on ego documents, meaning things like letters, memoirs, and interviews alongside newspapers and various other miscellaneous sources. Now, it's not always straightforward to gauge attitudes towards racism from these kinds of sources. Firstly, because such views are often not explicitly addressed or articulated. And also because people inevitably recraft their views over time, especially on a subject as charged as this, as social consensus changes. So I've tried to read the sources carefully with such issues in mind. And I've also tried to examine the choices and the actions of refugees for what they might reveal to us about underlying mindsets and approaches. So that's all by way of introduction. I want to move on now and set out for you just a bit of the context into which the refugees arrived before jumping into some examples from those ego documents I mentioned. Who were the refugees? Well, I mentioned there were around 6,000 of them. About 2/3 of those were male and 1/3 female. The majority of them were under the age of 40. While most men arrived alone, women tended to be married and to come with their families. There aren't any particular patterns of places in Germany where they came from. They came from all parts of Germany, from big cities, from small towns. And as far as I can tell, from quite a range of economic as well as educational backgrounds, and their levels of Jewish observance also varied, though many of them were relatively assimilated, as fits with the profile of German Jewry at this time. The refugees settled mostly in Cape Town, which is a coastal city, and Johannesburg, which is further inland. And like many other migrant communities, they initially kept to quite close-knit social circles, settling in the same neighborhoods, speaking German among themselves, and establishing their own social and religious organizations. And there's quite a rich historiography about those organizations. And at the same time, they maintained connections with family members who had been dispersed across the globe, and all of them in their new places of refuge struggled to craft new identities for themselves as Germans, as Jews, and in this case also as South Africans. So although this won't come as a surprise to anyone, it's worth starting off with and always having as a background how difficult the refugees' circumstances were. So one former refugee recalled, like so many of my compatriots, I arrived in Cape Town in 1936 without any funds, and what was even more serious, without the necessary deposit. I shall never forget my feeling of dismay while I sat on the deck of our ship, not knowing what was going to happen to me and not having the remotest idea of what the future held. I've never felt more miserable in my life. And this is also always an important background because the refugees are always seen as the lucky ones, the ones who saw the writing on the wall, the ones who were able to get out in time. But of course, as we increasingly in the scholarship trace their trajectories, those were not straightforwardly happy either. Many refugees struggled initially to find employment. Women were often the first breadwinners, as it was easier for them to find jobs as nurses or as babysitters or as cooks. And their husbands, until they found work, were left to do the shopping and the housekeeping. And there's, interestingly, a lot of commentary on the psychological effects of that in some of the literature, or at least in the sources. Some women supported their families for years while their husbands worked to reestablish professional careers. Other German Jews established their own enterprises in fields as diverse as clothing manufacture and retail, medicine, the arts, catering, and cattle farming. So over time, the refugees became integrated into the Jewish community, and really within a generation, it seems that their distinctiveness had largely dissipated. And while I mentioned in the introduction that they initially kept to close-knit social circles, they also made a very conscious effort to integrate themselves into their new homeland. They learned English well, they spoke it at home, and they contributed quite extensively to Jewish communal life. Now, the existing Jewish community in South Africa at that time, before the arrival of the German Jews, was of about 72,000 Jews of primarily Eastern European origin, primarily Lithuanian origin, who had migrated in the big turn of the century migrations. And they did not always make life easy for the German Jews. There are examples of this elsewhere, of course. The South African Jewish Board of Deputies had in fact actively discouraged German Jewish organizations from sending refugees to South Africa because of political concerns about immigration and fear of exacerbating anti-Semitism. Why was there this particular concern in South Africa? Well, the refugees' arrival coincided with a period of growing local anti-Semitism, and indeed it did exacerbate that anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism had not been absent from South Africa, excuse me, before the 1930s. But what we see in this period is an increase in explicitly political anti-Jewish behavior in a Nazi mold. And this is related to the growth of Afrikaner nationalism at this time, which I briefly mentioned in my introduction. So an earlier Quota Act passed in 1930 had targeted Jews from Eastern Europe, but a loophole still allowed German Jews to enter. But then in 1937, more restrictive legislation was passed in the form of the Aliens Act, which then reduced Jewish immigration from Germany to a trickle. And by the 1938 general election, anti-Semitism had become a central aspect of several mainstream political parties' platforms. What you can see on the slide over here is just one of many, perhaps the most prominent of many Nazi-inspired political movements. These are the gray shirts. Their full name was the South African Gentile National Socialist Movement. This is their newspaper, Die Waarheid, The Truth, with its swastika. And many of these organizations at this time very explicitly adopt Nazi iconography, Nazi visual iconography, and they begin to draw in popular audiences. And when the war broke out in September 1939, only a very narrow parliamentary majority supported the decision to join the fighting on the side of the Allies. So the refugees arrived into a society in which Jews were under particular strain. It's worth mentioning, though, that even before the refugees' arrival, Jews' status in the South African social landscape was not straightforward. And this is also what I alluded to in my introduction. Jews' efforts from the beginning of their arrival, if we go back to the migrations at the turn of the century, Jews' efforts to gain acceptance in South African society depended on their being recognized as white. And the emerging communal leadership engaged in a conscious effort to make Jews respectable and to remove the influence of so-called Peruvians. Peruvians is a derogatory term that was used to describe poor immigrant Jews from Eastern Europe. It's not entirely clear where the term comes from. There's been some debate in the literature. But the communal leadership was engaged in a very conscious effort to move away from this picture of Jews. The pursuit of a system of white supremacy picked up momentum in the early decades of the 20th century. And for Jews, it would have been clear that prospects for educational success, commercial success, upward mobility, political acceptance, all these things depended on their racial status. And so above all, what the Jewish leadership sought to do in that early period was to establish Jews as middle class and as white. Now, this is something we see to some extent as well in Jewish communities elsewhere. It's a complicated subject that I won't say much more about here, but the important point to emphasize is that South African Jews' whiteness was not secure or obvious, and that anti-Semitism that I described in the 1930s posed an added challenge to those long-standing communal efforts to establish Jews as white. Ironically, it was the advent of apartheid in 1948 that cemented Jews' status as white, as the new government sought to shore up as much support as possible from the so-called European community. And in the language of apartheid, of apartheid South Africa, European denoted white and non-European denoted non-white. At the same time, although apartheid brought a reprieve from public anti-Semitism, fear of anti-Semitism did not disappear, particularly given recent traumatic experiences in Europe. So the broad point, in short, is that the refugees' encounters with racism that I'm going to be describing took place against a very complicated backdrop in which they themselves occupied an uncomfortable and uncertain position. Okay, so let me move to outline briefly some of the trends that I've observed in EGO documents that I've been working with regarding the refugees' engagement with racism. And as always, the caveat here is I'm giving you just a handful of examples from what's obviously a much bigger corpus of sources. The first thing that emerges clearly is that few of the refugees had contact with Black people in Germany, and many of them commented on the unfamiliarity of their initial encounters. One refugee, Paul Hoffman, said, "We thought we would come directly into the jungle. We did not have the faintest idea about this country. I thought we would come into a country that was completely Black." Another, Hans Suskind, recalled, "We had seen Black people sometimes in the circus, but never saw them to talk to them. It was really strange to us." And we see these kinds of descriptions, this kind of language repeatedly echoed in the sources. Some of these refugees clearly linked the anti-Semitism that they had encountered in Germany to broader anti-Black racism, and I'll cite some of those examples later. But for most of these refugees, at least initially, these connections were not easily made. The refugees' accounts also suggest that most of them had a limited understanding of structural racism. So Kurt Leiser, who was interviewed in the early 1980s, was asked how he felt about Black people in 1936. And this, by the way, you know, I'm relying on existing sources, on existing interviews, memoirs. And there was a remarkably insightful interviewer in the 1980s who asked these questions of these German Jews. They're not questions that are often asked of South African Jews in interviews from the 1970s and 80s. But she, the one who conducted most of the interviews, actually asked these questions, which is fantastic. So she asked him, how did he feel about Black people when he arrived in 1936? And he answers, "When I arrived in the docks in Cape Town, I saw a considerable number of Black laborers trying to dock the boat. And already then unconsciously, I remember still today, I was thinking, it's not possible to treat human beings the way these people at the docks looked. And it was against my grain to see them looking the way they looked." However, when we continue reading Leiser's remarks, we get to see his limited understanding of structural inequality, even at a remove of almost 50 years. So then the interviewer goes on to ask him whether he treated Black people in the same way as any other Gentiles. And he replies, "Well, I never treated anybody different, and I would not treat a colored or a Black man any other way because it is just against my philosophy, that I would not want to be as badly treated as they have been treated myself. I must say that when I had the idea of going to Africa, I was quite prepared to being a laborer and building roads and this sort of thing. and was indeed pleasantly surprised that the country was developed already to such an extent that I was raised to a higher standard than I had expected, because the Black population is doing the labor that I thought I would have to do. Obviously, I was pleased of such a status in one way, but sad to see the Blacks not making any progress and improving their lot. So underlying his comment is the assumption that Black people have allowed themselves to be treated in this way, and also that they themselves were responsible for failing to improve their lot. And we have many, many similar accounts from the refugees about Black people failing to get somewhere because they've spent all their earnings on alcohol. They talk all the time about how they've shickered their earnings away, or they lacked discipline in their working practices. So remarks like these also suggest the need to consider class in understanding German Jewish attitudes. The nature of the South African labor market meant that in the early years after their arrival, the refugees often found it difficult to obtain unskilled work, as I suggested before. As one refugee put it in 1942, people who gave up their businesses and professions in Europe because they preferred to hew stones rather than live under the Nazi regime found that there were no possibilities of such labor for them in South Africa. And this, of course, is because of the widespread availability of cheap Black labor. So Kurt Leiser says that he was pleasantly surprised to have been raised to a higher standards, but actually many refugees were concerned about whether they would find employment at all. Either way, their perceptions of the people who performed these menial jobs were shaped in their accounts by notions of class as much as race. So this is Bella Stein, who's asked by an interviewer how German Jews related to Blacks. And she replies, I don't think it made any difference, not to us in any case. We treated them, how shall I say, as the working class people. Another refugee responding to a similar question said, I for one have no bias. If a person of any color is a gentleman, I respect him. And if he isn't, then I don't want to have anything to do with him. Now, class and race are, of course, deeply entangled, especially in the South African context. And in addition, of course, and here's the limitations of the sources, the political context of the early 1980s in which these refugees are giving their interviews when anti-apartheid resistance was gathering momentum, inevitably informed how they were framing their recollections of their initial interactions. So it's complicated to gauge these things from those interviews. Whatever their initial perceptions, it must be acknowledged that many of the refugees quickly accepted the racial status quo and sometimes explicitly appropriated its values and vocabulary. So this is from a 1983 interview with Fritz Kronheim, who acknowledged, we took the status of the underdog for granted, and they, Black South Africans, took it for granted. They were quite happy in their way of life. We took up the attitude of the other white people, considering them as born to do the hard labor. We did not think about it or have discussions about it like today. Like most other white South Africans, refugees found it unthinkable to socialize with non-whites. That's literally the word that recurs, unthinkable. There's no ways we would have had social relations. They referred to their domestic workers as girls and boys. And partly this is about the structure of apartheid South Africa. I mean, I suppose it goes without saying, but as someone said earlier today, if it goes without saying and then you say it clearly, we can remove that phrase. It is important to say that, you know, the purpose of this kind of historiography is not to judge, but rather to try and understand in nuanced and complex ways where these narratives and where these attitudes are coming from. So partly this is the social structure of apartheid South Africa, which makes it difficult for whites and non-whites to socialize, but also partly there are distinctive German Jewish patterns for how these relationships work out and how these attitudes manifest. So in a pamphlet that was produced by the Association for Jewish Refugees in 1955, the correspondent from Johannesburg candidly observed that although the refugees had a difficult time, in South Africa, they at least had a white skin and therefore automatically became worthy of all the privileges that white South Africa reserves for itself. This is not to say that German Jews have joined the extreme nationalists or are openly advocating apartheid. but I know a good few who in their attitude toward the native population vie with the most rabid Afrikaner on the platteland. In other words, they are extremely racist, and hardly anybody who would stick out his neck on behalf of the non-European population. The majority are no doubt slightly uneasy about it all, and to ease their conscience are doing all they can in the way of charity. This to me is an interesting bit of his account. They maintain that it cannot be their job to change the South African way of life, and that by accepting South African hospitality, they accepted white South African standards. So the fact that German Jews gradually became white South Africans is not unexpected, is not surprising to me. And I think the notion that past experience of racism makes a person more sensitive to racism or likely to oppose racism is not really something that's borne out by the historical evidence. But I think there are significant nuances in this account that are worth noting. The idea that most refugees were uneasy about apartheid, that they sought ways to ease their conscience, but at the same time, they considered what he called white standards to be the inescapable cost of accepting life-saving refuge in South Africa. So against this background, it's perhaps unsurprising to find as another recurring theme in personal accounts, the desire to avoid politics altogether. Charles Wallach, who was the son of refugees, said politics simply didn't play a part in their minds. They were pleased to be able to get out and get their parents out. This is from a refugee, Martin Uli Mautner, who said many who stayed turned to a form of internal immigration. My impression is that they would not be nearly as active in the struggle against apartheid as were those with roots in Eastern Europe. And as I suggested earlier, his impression on that front was certainly correct. Hardly a German Jewish name is to be found among the ranks of radical anti-apartheid activists, among whom, as I said, there are many Jews, but almost no German Jews. This is not to suggest, however, that all German Jews were uninterested in or indifferent to South African racism. And I want to go on now to mention three broad areas in which some German Jewish refugees sought to engage with this issue. Firstly, in the area of formal politics. And what I suggested in my introduction is that where German Jews are doing this, they're engaging with politics within legal parameters. So a handful of German Jews became involved with the Liberal Party during its relatively brief existence in the 1950s and early 1960s. More substantially, several German Jewish refugees also campaigned actively for the United Party in the late 1930s and 40s. Now, what this signaled politically is not totally straightforward. Compared with the National Party, that's the party in government that emerged from the Afrikaner nationalist movement, was an exclusivist anti-Semitic party that had supported the Nazi war effort. The United Party was a more comfortable home for South Africa's Jews, but it needs to be emphasized that despite more reform-minded policies, shall we say, it was also firmly predicated on white dominance. At the same time, there were liberal elements that later broke with the party to pursue more progressive reforms, and prominent among those liberal elements was, among others, the German Jewish refugee lawyer and politician Harry Schwartz, who had come to South Africa from Germany in 1934 at the age of 10, and in the late 1960s emerged as the leader of the United Party's anti-apartheid faction. Schwartz also continued his legal work throughout his political career, and among others, he served on the defense team of the Rivonia trial, and this was the prominent trial in 1963-64 that led to the imprisonment of Nelson Mandela, among others. So examples like Harry Schwartz and the absence of German Jews among radical anti-apartheid activists suggest that refugees who chose to participate in political work felt more comfortable doing so within legal parameters in liberal politics. Many refugees also looked beyond formal politics to engage with contemporary South African social issues, problems. And we have numerous examples of German Jews, particularly women, who did pioneering work in the area of social welfare. One notable example is a German Jewish woman from Berlin, a social worker, who's documented in the archive only as Mrs. B. I find that this fascinating that, when I went looking for the women, most of the women that I could find are not even documented by their names. So the next job is to kind of figure out exactly who these women were. But this Mrs. B established a self-help association that ultimately fed over 20,000 children daily and ran several dozen nursery schools and youth training projects. Another, who is documented as Mrs. G, spearheaded the development of low-priced protein foods for mass consumption, and her aim was to try and tackle rampant malnutrition among Black people. The foods that were produced by her factory were quickly adopted by feeding schemes, and their innovations were emulated by other industrialists. And there are various other examples that are emerging from the archives of German Jewish refugees who engaged in this kind of welfare work that was deliberately targeted beyond the Jewish community. So this is where I'm interested in. I mean, these women did not write about, their attitudes towards racism, but if we look beyond the welfare work that's directed within the community itself, what are people doing that's directed outside of the Jewish community and towards deprived populations? We've known for a long time that South African Jewish women in general undertook extensive work in outreach and social welfare among underprivileged populations, but because the scholarship has been focused primarily on the communal leadership, which was almost exclusively male, we know almost nothing about this work. And it's just one area of Jewish encounters with non-whites that has hardly been investigated. Another crucial area is the domestic sphere. Almost all white families had domestic workers, gardeners, and other non-white helpers who often lived with them. And we know very little about Jews' engagement with such people in their own domestic environment. So these are areas that are ripe for further research. A third area of German Jewish engagement was in cultural and intellectual life. And a key institution in this regard was the Independent Cultural Association. This was a group that was set up by and for German Jewish refugees in July 1936, so quite early on. And the association's members were academics, artists, writers, musicians, and they held regular cultural evenings and lectures. We have the programs of the various activities they engaged in. One of the association's key aims was to advance immigrants' understanding of South African culture and to facilitate their integration. And so in order to do this, the association devoted some of its programs to talks about South African society. Now, the association was not itself a political organization, and in fact, explicitly reminded its audiences of the fact that it was not a political organization. But it often hosted events in partnership with the liberal South African Institute of Race Relations. And it invited all sorts of social activists and critics of segregation to come and speak. One of the first lectures it presented, titled An Introduction to the Social Problems of South Africa, was given by the social activist and welfare worker Hansie Pauline Pollock, who later became vice president of the South African Institute of Race Relations. Other lecture subjects, if we look through their programs, include things like native education, the non-European inhabitants of the Union, native policy today and tomorrow, African literature, and there's a clear pattern of interest. And to me, most strikingly, on the association's 40th anniversary in 1976, which was an especially fraught moment in the history of apartheid. This was the year of the Soweto uprising. The writer and academic Dr. Richard Reeve delivered a lecture on Black consciousness. Those who were invited to lecture at the association included university professors and lots of prominent leaders associated with the South African Institute of Race Relations and the liberal movement in South Africa. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the circle of refugees that the association attracted tended to be left-leaning and younger than other refugee organizations. So one notable figure was Franz Auerbach. I couldn't find a photograph of him himself, but this is the cover of his book, his memoir. He arrived in Johannesburg from Germany in 1937 at the age of 14 and went on to have a very distinguished career in education, including 20 years of association with African night schools and influential publications on the impact of prejudice on Black education. And in addition to that educational work, that activist educational work, he was involved with the association, beginning in 1947 and continuing until the association closed in 1976. And alongside this work, he served in numerous political and social organizations, including the South African Institute of Race Relations, which I've mentioned, Jews for Social Justice, the South African Yad Vashem Foundation, and others. So that's Franz Auerbach. Another figure to mention is Ruth Weiss. She came to South Africa from Germany aged 12 in 1936 and had a distinguished career as an anti-racist activist and journalist. What's also interesting about the three examples mentioned so far, Harry Schwartz, Franz Auerbach, and Ruth Weiss, is that they all came as children and began engaging in their activist work a decade or two or three after they had arrived. While few women, apart from Weiss, feature in the public records of the association, the question of refugee women's involvement with its work is an area that I think warrants deeper archival investigation. Radical activist Jews tended to disavow any links between their activism and their Jewishness. Partly this was because to dwell on one's Jewishness would have bought in too much to apartheid's language of ethnic separateness. But if you look at the narratives of Jewish anti-apartheid activists, many of them deny an explicitly Jewish origin to their activism. By contrast, German Jews like Harry Schwartz, Ruth Weiss, Franz Auerbach that I've mentioned, and others consistently highlighted the connections between their anti-racism, their Jewishness, and their refugee pasts. For example, from the perspective of his family, as well as by his own account, Harry Schwartz's commitment to social justice in South Africa was shaped by his childhood experiences in Nazi Germany. This quote is from a 1991 interview where he's explaining his lifelong devotion to anti-racist activism. He said, "I know what the word discrimination means, not because I've read it in a book, but because I've been the subject of it." Franz Auerbach often spoke about how his experiences in Nazi Germany had informed his opposition to institutionalized racism. And in his many interviews and talks in the memoir that was up on the screen just a moment ago, he often drew parallels between Nazism and apartheid. And he also often deliberately invoked the comparison in order to urge, is the politest way of putting it, to urge his fellow Jews to protest local injustice. Ruth Weiss also made frequent connections between her refugee past and her lifelong commitment to social justice. She's describing here an event where she was interviewed in Germany in 1979, writing about it later in her memoir. She says, "I speak of those years explaining what it meant to be a small, unwanted girl in Hitler's Germany. I also tell them what it means to be a Black child in apartheid South Africa. Blacks under apartheid, Jews under the swastika, was it all that different? It was a question I had to ask myself a long time ago. Racism is unacceptable. Social injustice is unacceptable anywhere." And these kinds of analogies are woven throughout Weiss's own accounts of her work by others, and indeed the other refugees who I've mentioned. So for a minority group among the refugees, and I'll really stress this, the association, the Independent Cultural Association, was really for a minority of refugees. It was a forum that provided cultural familiarity as well as intellectual stimulation and engagement with contemporary South African life. Within the broader social orbit of this association were socialist journalists, an art dealer from an illustrious Berlin family called Reinhold Kassira, who nurtured promising Black artists, and perhaps more interestingly, Kassira's wife, who was the novelist Nadine Gordimer, Ilse Dadou, who was married for a time to the communist activist Yusuf Dadou, Liberal Party activists, and various others. And Weiss recalled that while her refugee parents shared her views about apartheid broadly, they discouraged her involvement with the association because they equated political with communist, and they felt that it was too dangerous in the context of apartheid South Africa to have been involved with such an organization. But as I suggested at the beginning, only a handful of German Jews were at all interested in communist or socialist politics, perhaps unsurprisingly given the apartheid government's extreme anti-communism. Those who chose to participate in anti-racist work of whatever kind confined themselves primarily to the social and cultural arenas, a trend that suggests our understanding of refugees' responses would benefit from deeper investigation of literary and artistic production alongside overtly political work. Okay, so to move towards a conclusion, how do we account for the particular responses of German Jewish refugees to South African racism? To begin with, or to end with too, it's worth emphasizing again the countless challenges that these individuals confronted, and that this is not an exercise in blaming, but rather of understanding the nuances. The experience of fleeing Nazism, compounded by the anti-Semitism that they encountered when they arrived in South Africa, left them vulnerable and insecure. Like refugees everywhere, they suffered from diminished social and economic status, from loneliness, the trauma of losing families, homes. The historian Stephen Aschheim notes that within this context, and I'm quoting now from Aschheim, it was quite simply gratitude, which was the most characteristic and understandable response of these German Jewish immigrants to their adopted country. In the months and years following their arrival, they focused on recreating their lives and keeping a low profile. Having finally found a safe haven, their main aim was integration, and most of them were simply too preoccupied with the basic concerns of existence to be worried about institutionalized racism. In her famous 1943 article, We Refugees, Hannah Arendt criticized the withdrawal from public life that she saw among many of her fellow refugees in the United States. She suggested that a healthier response was to confront injustice and remind the world that what happens to Jews first happens to others next. With the passage of time, some of the refugees' children in South Africa turned to tackling the injustices of apartheid along the lines of Arendt's advice, and they cited their parents' experiences as a key motivating factor. But for the first generation, I would say such a response was almost impossibly unrealistic. The anthropologist Stephen Robbins, who's written about his refugee father, says, "My father could not channel his private experience of loss and exile into a politically engaged response. He turned away from the world and became a private man, committed to raising a family and remaking his life at the tip of Africa." And I think the life stories of many German Jews across the world follow a similar pattern. In his book, Generation Exodus, Walter Lacour concluded that most of the refugees who reached the United States, Latin America, elsewhere, were not particularly politically minded, and that there was very little radical politics among them for similar reasons to what I've outlined here. In the immediate post-war years, the main aim was to integrate as quickly as possible and to become a loyal member of one's new homeland. While the lack of engagement with South African politics makes sense against this background, particularly in the early years of settlement, it also has to be acknowledged that what began as a tacit acceptance of the status quo later became for some a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. Like most South African Jews, refugees from Nazi Germany came to enjoy the economic benefits of apartheid, to live comfortable, affluent lives as white South Africans. Aschheim again suggests that the professional and economic success that they gradually acquired in South Africa, I'm quoting from him now again, was a powerful combination, limiting, if not entirely eliminating, any inclination to generalize from their own experience of racial injustice in Germany and protest against what was happening in South Africa. That's the end of the quote. We need more research to understand more fully the extent to which economic interests shaped Jews' attitudes towards apartheid, but certainly their success in the economic sphere and simply their material comfort and affluence was undoubtedly an element of their comfort in South Africa, and must account, at least in part, for their withdrawal from politics. At the same time, there were those German Jewish refugees, as I've suggested, who took note of South African racism and its effects, though they did so in quite different ways to radical activists. The Independent Cultural Association was unusual among refugee institutions in that it openly addressed questions of race relations, as the term was in those days. But as I've suggested, even this engagement was largely intellectual, and those who pursued these interests in their working lives did so judiciously and legally in spheres like education or journalism or social work or liberal politics. In part, these choices reflected their middle-class German origins, in stark contrast, I think, to the influences that led some Eastern European Jews to trade union work or to communist politics. But in part, they must also have stemmed from the refugees' inclination to seek stability and security after such traumatic personal experiences. German Jews' activities in these areas challenge our thinking about Jewish responses to apartheid and about Jewish responses to racism, to post-war racism more broadly. While scholarship and popular memory have focused on the individual Jews who opposed apartheid or the responses of the leadership, very little attention has been paid to the responses of ordinary Jewish men and women who had to navigate these complex issues at many different levels in society, at home, at work. The responses of the refugees offer a fresh perspective onto this question and remind us that we still have much to learn about the complex ways in which ordinary Jews engaged with racism in the aftermath of the Holocaust.